Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Innovation Forum webinar. We'll get started now. For everyone joining for the first time for an Innovation Forum webinar, we like to do things a little bit differently. We'd like to really try and get audience question and answer from the start. So basically, is my first point of starting the webinar is ask questions as you have them throughout. I have a bunch of questions, but I just want to note this now, and I'll keep reminding you throughout the webinar to put in your questions into the Q&A. I'll just do a quick few openings to introduce the panel. But as a reminder for anyone tuning in, there should be a little pop-up showing up on your screen to answer a poll. So if you just click open and then add your thoughts, it'll help us frame the conversation. The question is, what is the biggest challenge in scaling climate smart agriculture? I can see already almost 20 replies, so that'll be really great if everyone, for the 150 plus that we have in the room already, to add your thoughts. So we have a really great panel joining us today, and then a really great audience. So I have a bunch of questions to ask that we'll go through a little bit at the start, but to help frame the conversation. But then we'll turn to audience question and answer quite quickly. Whenever possible, if you could ask the question directly to one of the panelists through the Q&A function, I'll just mean that we can get through more questions through the full hour that we have. Yeah, big thank you to Agreena for making this webinar possible. We're going to hear from Simon shortly, but I just wanted to say a big thank you for making this possible. These are the kind of conversations that we love hosting in Innovation Forum, and they're only really possible through partnering with organizations like Agreena. So thank you very much. But we have Simon Haldrup, the CEO of Agreena, that will be joining us as a panelist today. We have Thomas Gent, who's a regenerative farmer based in the UK. We have the slide is opening. We have Petit, who's works at Mars Pet Care on these issues, and Reineke from Nespresso. So a really fantastic, varied organization lineup here. So maybe if we have around 40 replies to the Slido, if we could just show the results now, that'll help us frame the conversation as I turn to Thomas first. Perfect. It's loading for me. I don't know if I can see the results, so maybe I'll find them later on. But Thomas, I don't know if you're able to see the results, but if you are, let me know. I think basically it would be great to set the scene first from your side when we're trying to figure out how do we set up this panel. Set the scene for us a little bit. What is actually happening on the ground? You were literally in the perfect placement for this, so thanks for that. But yeah, introduce yourself. What do you do? And in the wide world of what climate smart agriculture means, what does it mean to you specifically?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for the introduction. So hello everybody, virtually welcome to my farm, literally. So yeah, I'm a farmer. We farm in the UK, kind of near Cambridge, if you know your UK geography. We farm 800 hectares, and we've been farming in a climate smart way. Depends what your terminology is. I'm sure we'll get into this, but we've been farming using kind of traditional regenerative practices for the past 17 years. So we started in 2008. I'm 27, so I'm not going to take responsibility for that decision on our farm. Luckily, I have a really kind of forward-thinking granddad and dad who made that transition to really a big switch on our farming practice. We were in a very heavy plough-based system, and we moved to a full direct drill no-till system. We've been learning ever since. It's had a lot of changes. It's had a lot of effect on our farming business. In the early stages, it was pretty tough. In the latter stages, and now where we're up to, and especially this year, actually, I've just been looking at some fields this morning. We can see massive differences of our fields compared to neighbours at the moment. When we look at our profitability, that's also where I get much happier compared to my neighbours. So yeah, and the kind of underlying kind of support to all of this, and the bit that I really push within our farming business is how we can understand the data that we're working with a bit more, especially the financial data and how that affects decision making on farm. I also excitingly get to work with farmers across the UK and Europe through working with Agreena to be able to support them during their transition to regenerative agriculture as well. So I think I have good exposure to how it affects lots of different farmers in lots of different ways. And we've done lots of advice to different farms in different situations of their transition as well.
Thank you. I mean, maybe exactly on those points, you said that you've seen massive differences already of on-farm changes. Could you share a few of what those are?
Yeah, so I would kind of probably boil them all down to resilience. So in times of, well, actually in the UK, we're having a bit of a drought period at the minute. It's pretty dry. Crops, our neighbours' crops are actually starting to suffer slightly from that. You can see it when you drive
Mm,
past. Ours are really still sitting pretty green and still pretty resilient because that soil's kind of in a good enough state to hold the moisture. So there's a lot of like kind of climate resilient factors that that we see the difference in year on year. And that's really down to the health of the soil effectively. But then in terms of also financially, we actually benchmark our financial performance against a group of conventional farms locally, and we can see we're fairly significantly more profitable per hectare on a kind of rolling average basis. And that's really due to reduced cost. It's not really reduced we haven't really got increased yield. I would say our yield's about the same, but our costs are orders of magnitude less.
yeah, perfect. I mean, and as we're going to go into a bit more of examples of how we can scale, what have been the biggest challenges that you face? Are there any specific sort of practical examples that you can share for people in the room? We have people joining from all kinds of geographies, so there's an element of, every single farm will be different.
Yeah.
But what is it, what are the challenges that you have faced? And maybe we can go through that in then a bit more detail.
Yeah,
So
I
far in the
think
transition, and then what are still the ones that you're facing? Sorry,
yeah,
Thomas.
absolutely. No, sorry. It's I think definitely let's reinforce that point of like no farm is the same, and like the context of your farming position matters hugely. But yeah, for us specifically, we made that transition a long time ago, 2008. There wasn't that many people doing it back then. So our biggest issue was really knowledge. There wasn't much about in the market. There wasn't much experience. There is a fair bit now. And oh, sorry, it's a dog. Our other big issue was our other big issue was sorry. Our other big issue was machinery. So when we first transitioned, our biggest issue was we just couldn't get access to the right machinery. And now there's a lot more different machinery available. And Grandad actually developed a machine that's sold all over the world now, really. So they're the kind of two biggest issues we had at the start. Our biggest issue now, I think, is like we've been doing it for a long time compared to others. So now my question is like, which I always try to push Dad, is like, what do we do that's next? What's like the next thing in 15 years that we're going to look back and go, oh my God, I'm so glad we did that. I'm not sure. I've got a few ideas, but who knows?
I think you've just figured out how we can end the session. Maybe at the end, we can turn to every single person and say, where are we going to be sitting together in 15 years? What are we going to be saying and how are we going to look back on all of this? So that could be an interesting point to close off on, to hear all of those points. I love that you mentioned knowledge sharing, because that is also the biggest word in this word cloud is, I guess, probably lack of knowledge or lack of knowledge sharing or inability or to share that knowledge. When you're working, well, do you work with other farmers on this? If you do, how do you instill that knowledge or share that knowledge? Where did you get that knowledge in the first place? How does that sharing work?
Yeah, good question. So in a kind of like practical sense of, how do I do it on my individual field? The best thing that I see all the time is just farmers visiting other farmers. So we do it here. We host lots of farm walks here, and we also go and see lots of different farms all the time. And like the only thing that I've ever really seen work properly is getting a farmer to go to a field with another farmer and talk about what their situation and what's happened and what they learned and what went well and what went wrong and all that kind of thing, and then fitting it into their situation. That works super well. But in kind of a broader sense of how do we educate really the supply chain, I hope webinars, that's why I like to join webinars like this, right? So we can, this is probably the kind of cringe point, but I always encourage anybody who works in the supply chain, if you haven't got out on farm at least once a year, then there's something wrong.
Yeah. No, I think it'll be so interesting to hear from the other panelists on how that works and how that knowledge sharing works. There are already a few questions, so maybe just to rattle through them quickly before. There's a specific question on how you're measuring biodiversity on farm. Is that something that you do? How are you measuring it beyond soil health? is what they mentioned specifically? Just, I guess, quickly to help frame again.
Yeah, super good question. But like biodiversity is one of those things that I'm definitely not doing perfectly on measuring, and I'm still figuring out how to do. So obviously we can measure the habitat we have. So we have X amount of hedges, we have X amount of flowers, flower margins, all that kind of thing. I do that. That's fairly straightforward. But measuring the actual life that's in those situations, we have had ecological surveys in the past, but that's only like a snapshot in time. There's some interesting tech that we're looking at trying there's a lot of interesting tech now about listening to the kind of insects and birds and pollinators. And these tech can interpret bird song, obviously, and then decide what birds it is. But yeah, so my honest answer is I'm not very good at it and I would like to get better.
I do love the sound of bird song as you say the words bird song in the background. There was also a quick question from on what would be the first step in transitioning. And we have people joining from corporates, from service providers, from NGOs, from governments, but also farmers joining this conversation. So what would your advice be on the first step in transitioning?
Yeah, so from a farmer's perspective, definitely the first step is to understand what you currently have. So you need to understand your context effectively. So what state is your soil currently in? What machinery do you have available? What resources might you have available kind of in your situation? So my always first point is you really need to understand your own situation as best as possible. And then I would encourage you to go and visit farmers that seem kind of similar to your situation to see what they're doing and how things are changing for them. But then if you're not a farmer, everybody else in the supply chain, I think my answer is always very clear on that, is you need to go and just visit some farms.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, Thomas. Okay, we'll move on to Simon. As you can see, I'm going to be trying to weave in questions as we go on. So if you have any reminder, just put them in the chat as much as possible. If you could direct them to a speaker, that makes it so much easier on my side and makes it so I can get to more questions. So we've gotten a bit of a picture of on the ground realities. Simon, you work with Thomas, but also many, many more farmers. Maybe if you first introduce yourself, Agreena, and then kind of what does that look like for your organization working with farmers?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me. My name is Simon. I'm the CEO of a 150 people company in Copenhagen. We call it Agreena. We're not in Copenhagen, but all over Europe because we operate in 20 countries. We actually have the privilege of working with farmers all across Europe, which also gives a quite interesting view to what are the challenges and both the common denominators and the differences in both the challenges and the adoption pattern of farmers adopting regenerative practices all across Europe. As a company, we are priding ourselves to be super farmer centric, and we do that because our mission is very clear. How can we scale regenerative agriculture both in Europe and further out? And that always, and just to build on Thomas's point, that always starts with a farmer that changes behavior. This is, in essence, a huge behavioral change process for millions and millions of farmers across the planet that we have to do as fast as meaningfully possible. And therefore, we have been very obsessed with what actually drives that, what holds farmers back. And a little bit dependent on the context Thomas was alluding to, we found that it has a lot to do with actually community. What is the community the farmer is in? What is the norm? Two is knowledge. But the most important factor is economic stability. Because whereas Thomas's family, 17 years after initiating a transition, has significant better unit profitability, that is rarely the case for the first few years for farmers transitioning, and with low profit margins, and also sometimes quite bleak outlooks to what that transition could entail. That holds the majority of the farmers back in conventional practices. And we try to address that by building a lot of technology, a lot of models, a lot of measurements to help farmers overcoming all three of those barriers. And one of the things we do is to measure and create data on every single field and try to capture all those specifics there is about a field, its history, its context, its soil, its weather conditions, its cropping, etc., and turn that into both carbon footprints, but also to help farmers understand how they can implement new practices. And then we actually turn those footprints into carbon credits or supply chain interventions that actually help create a revenue stream for the farmer. So they have an offsetting revenue stream for those costs that are connected with initial transition. Well, it's a very long speech, but that's what we do.
No, that's perfect. You've already answered like so many of my questions in one. I just want to know more,
Cool.
basically, are my main ones. So the main challenges you would say that you're seeing on farm level, is it still, so it's mainly on economic stability? Is that what you're still seeing? Or the ones that you're now working with, what does that then look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we have initially worked a lot with large farmers, and large farmers, they tend to have a longer planning horizon, has been my experience. They are looking 5, 7, 10 years, maybe even out, and see the business case, if you will, in what Thomas described: healthier soils, lower cost of inputs, lower cost of machinery and workforce, and therefore and also mitigating some of those changes in climate situations where more and more effective droughts and floods are changing the economic outcome for farmers. So they are thinking strategically about it, and they can afford, in most cases, that initial transition cost. Smaller farmers tend to have a one harvest planning horizon, and I'm generalizing vastly here, but I think that's the pattern we're seeing. And small and medium farmers have quite tight profit margins in general, and therefore they cannot necessarily afford to see and I'm just throwing a number, 20% loss of yield for the first 2 years because the soil is transitioning to a new state, and therefore that fear of economic stability is one of the absolute most important hesitations we feel with farmers. And to build and generally, even though look, I'm from Copenhagen, no farmer trusts me. So how do we overcome that? They need to hear it from other farmers that have been there, done that, and operate a little bit like them. That is the most important driver of building in that trust.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge, important point that I'd love to go into maybe now a little bit more. That trade-off or that intersection between asking for data, building that trust with farmers. What have you seen that works well in how you communicate to farmers? Where does that data go? What are you measuring? What is important here? What is then done with that information? How do you build that and hone that trust with farmers?
Yeah, I think the most important trust with farmers is, one is that you're not misusing their data, and two is that actually it's a little bit of a farmer to farmer dialogue that happens. That's also why that in our company we have a lot of farmers that are talking to other farmers because that is how the mobilization happens. In terms of data, it's really really important. I think all farmers you'll meet will claim that their farm is an N of one. It's unique in everything from how the farm set up, the history, the practices, the cropping rotation, etc., etc. And therefore, averages doesn't really work in this space. And therefore, it's hugely important to capture the very, very specific biology and management practices, not of just every single farmer, every single field. We capture more than 200 data points on every single field, and being able to play that back to the farmer in a way that is trustworthy, so they actually recognize this is actually my farm and my field, is super important. And two is, as we're then taking that footprint or those that change carbon profile through the supply chain or out to a carbon market in order to drive monetization or ecosystem payments for that, then integrity and the ability to verify these factors is absolutely paramount.
Yeah, another verification part. I mean, on that point of interoperability, since you're operating in over 20 countries, are you seeing any sort of progress on sort of multiple buyers from one farm working together on this? Is there movement in that? What is working at the moment?
Yeah, it's a big topic. To take it positively first, I think it's actually the positive news is that it's becoming a topic, and it becoming a topic means that there's an interest to provide ecosystem service payment to farmers in the first place, whether that then comes from the supply chain or from carbon markets or a third place. So that's actually a positive starting point. The challenge is then that those style of payments does not always fit well together. A farmer can grow many different crops, and different companies buy those crops either through different elevator, different producers, and therefore it rarely makes sense for one company to make one long-term agreement with a farmer and saying, I'll pay you for all your ecosystem services, because they actually only offtake one crop. And sometimes there's also grown a crop in a rotation which doesn't fit in through the supply chain. Then either the farmer does not have a payment, or that payment needs to come from somewhere else, for example, carbon markets. So it is hugely important in order to create that economic stability to the farmer that we manage to integrate that interoperability. That has a lot to do with collaboration across the industry. That has a lot to do with technology rails that can make, because it doesn't scale if it's 2 or 3 farmers. It needs to work across millions of farmers. And ultimately, I think it's about regulation and methodologies coming together. It's still early days, but if I compare to where we were 2 years ago, it's an exponential movement.
Okay. I mean, we've zoomed out, but maybe just even to kind of maybe summarize the points. There's a question from Sarah on recommendations for farmers who want to pilot RegenAg before full rollout. What would you say to those organizations in the room?
Absolutely. Look, I need to repeat, there is not a one size fits all. If the right formula for a farmer, we're working with a lot of farmers in Ukraine, for example. That formula looks very different from a farmer in Spain or in UK or just within that country. So context is super important. What we often see is that farmers, they start with 1 or 2 practices on part of their field just to do the comparison, right? And typically it's actually to go from a full plowing regime into a more minimum tillage or reduced tillage regime, and then leaving residues on the field. So they add organic inputs or building cover crops into the way they're cropping. Feel free to add in, Thomas. You have a practical take on this. I would just add, it is quite interesting to see that typically Eastern European farmers, they go much faster into that, whereas Western European farmers typically they dabble a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Thomas, would you like to add anything at this point?
I was just going to say, I think if Simon's getting asked by a farmer what they should do on the field, he should maybe give them my phone number. instead. But I think you're right. I think it's really interesting to see different farms in different situations. And I've definitely seen the same. The larger scale operations are generally they're not family businesses. They're generally investment type businesses, and that means they can take that kind of longer term approach, and they also might have access to some capital and things to help them along. Whereas smaller family focused farms, which is really like most of Western Europe, right, is trickier.
Perfect. There were also, and I want to get to Claire and Reineke right after this, but there were 2 questions from Carolina and, well, there was 1 question from Carolina, 1 question from Stephen, both asking sort of, Simon, could you help define or explain how you define regenerative agriculture? What does that mean so that we're all on the same page? That big question.
Was that for me?
Yes.
Okay. So I think this is a divisive theme. Personally, I see regenerative agriculture as a broad toolbox, and it maybe to build in some contexts, regenerative agriculture is everything from integration of livestock to cover cropping, intercropping, residue management, reducing fertilizer. Whereas in other contexts, it's a different toolbox. So the toolbox, personally, I'm not sure. Some people call it conservation agriculture. Some people call it climate smart agriculture. For me, the common denominator is enhanced soil health in order to drive better climate resilience, better biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and water management. That so much more outcome focused than actually the practice. I'm pretty sure, to Thomas's initial questions, everywhere we work with farmers that have been on this journey 10 plus years, they're still implementing new practice. It's a moving target all the time. Now we are entering a decade with a lot of biology that will come into play in this. So I'm pretty sure that the cover crops we're looking at in 3 years are completely different from those we're looking at now. So it's a continuous innovation, and I'm much more occupied with the outcomes we're looking for.
Perfect. Thank you, Simon. I mean, that kind of leads perfectly into a little bit of questions to Claire and Reineke. I also like that we've already touched on knowledge and funding quite a bit, which were the two biggest words in the word cloud on the question of how do we scale these approaches. So I hope everyone's seeing like what the answers are to that already a little bit. But if you have any other questions, please do ask. Maybe Claire, from your side, introduce yourself, give us an overview of what does climate smart agriculture, RegenAg maybe specifically, look like for an organization like Mars Pet Care to start framing that conversation. And yeah, why is this important to an organization like Mars?
Thanks for having me. So I'm Claire Petit, and I lead the climate strategy for Mars Pet Care in Europe. Together with a group of incredible colleagues, we are working on advancing our agenda on packaging, logistics, sourcing, operation, etc., toward our net zero goal. Mars Pet Care is actually the biggest pet care company in the world, and we are responsible for feeding 500 million dogs worldwide, which is a big responsibility. And we are very committed to our purpose, which is a better world for pets. So as part of this, I don't know if everyone knows, but Mars is actually a family-owned business. So it really allows us to think very long-term in generations, basically, and not only in short business cycle. And this long-term thinking has enabled us to drive a sustainability approach that we actually call Sustainable in a Generation plan. And that has led to our net zero roadmap that we have published 2 years ago. 60% of our footprint at Mars Inc. is actually linked with agriculture. So the potential for reduction and removal in our ingredient is massive. And therefore, regenerative agriculture or climate smart ag, we actually use both words internally, is a key component of this roadmap. And additionally, conventional agriculture is not sustainable. It contributes to soil degradation, decline of biodiversity, overall pollution, etc. And this is where, for us, regenerative agriculture really come into play. First of all, as I said, to reduce farming emission, so we can contribute to the global effort of mitigating greenhouse gas emission. And second of all, which is actually even more important, is to adapting the farming system for a more resilient sourcing against climate change. Today, across all of the initiatives that we launched, we are keeping in mind a couple of core principles that you will, you have heard from Simon and Thomas, actually. It's the same, so it's quite reassuring. The first one is context specific. So as Thomas said, there is not one recipe, there is not one size fits all. And what works, for example, on wheat in Poland might be very different from what works on corn in France. And at Mars, we always adapt to the local context and the farm specificities. So, soil type, but also the machinery existing at the farm, the weather, the climate, etc. The second key principle that we have in mind, it's collaboration. So I know Thomas and Simon touch on that as well. So of course, collaboration within the farmers, but that's not really our goal. It's more the goal of our partners and farmers. But basically, we cannot do it on our own. Nobody can. And we need the commitment, the involvement from the farmers, but also from our intermediary suppliers, from the local experts that can support the farmer, and also industry peers. So we always work with this local ecosystem to bring the technical knowledge and innovation that work on a specific context for every farmer. And the third key principle is to measure, monitor, and then scale up, of course. So today, the early progress we have are very encouraging. We have a lot to achieve. The good news is that today we have 30 initiatives on the globe that are underway. And we are beginning to move from pilot to scale. And data here, all the measurement, everything is really helping us to scale up our programs. And we have actually an ambition to reach 1 million acres. So it's about 400,000 hectares of regenerative agriculture practices by 2030.
Perfect. Thank you, Claire. There were some clarifying questions, maybe just to go through them quickly. What commodities overall are you looking at in all of this, just to reinforce that?
So our strategy is to cover all of our main commodities. So grain, mainly grain and animal proteins. We have started with grains. So quite widely, it's mainly different type of grains. Wheat, corn, oat, barley. That's what we have started with in Europe. But we are also aiming at tackling soy and also animal proteins.
Perfect. And is the sourcing, where are the main sourcing regions for this?
So in grain, we source a lot. Everything is European sourced. And on the grain part, we source a lot in Eastern Europe. I mean, generally, it's quite a big sourcing zone for us because we also have big factories in this place.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Claire. I mean, on the point on data as well, like when you're trying to collect all of this data and then synthesize it in a way that then works for internal conversations with different teams, sustainability teams, but also procurement or also CFO or CEO, how do you translate or how do you use data to build that business case to then basically incentivize farmers, but then also as a business to incentivize these sort of projects?
Yeah. So the point on incentivizing farmers is very key. And today, as Simon said, or Thomas, sorry, I forgot exactly who, but by doing regenerative practices, the farmers are actually doing a benefit for the ecosystem. They are creating a positive outcome, and we need to reward them for this one. Sorry, for those KPIs. And in order to do so, we actually need strong data to ensure that, first of all, we pay them fairly, and second of all, that we're also on the right path toward decarbonizing our business. So we need strong data and strong measurement on that. And today, our business case are mainly focused on carbon data because it's the only robust data we have, but we have a stake actually to also incorporate further positive outcomes, whether it's biodiversity or protected biodiversity, improved soil health, protected water resources in our business case to actually create a complete business case that show the positive financial consequences of regenerative agriculture for our business as well, and on the resilience of our sourcing.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Claire. If anyone has any more questions, please post in the chat and I'll try to get to them as soon as possible. But Reineke, last but certainly not least, thank you so much for joining us. But really, maybe since you're kind of here to round out the conversation a little bit as well, is there anything specific that you wanted to reflect on from the speakers? Please let us know. Obviously, Nespresso has a little bit of a different supply chain than others, so I'm really looking forward to digging into your thoughts. But before that, is there anything specific that you wanted to share or reflect on?
Yeah, Tanya, thank you. And thank you for having me. I think, first of all, all the three other panel members were really telling the story, which part of it are also relevant for Nespresso. Yeah, before I'll go into the supply chain of Nespresso, let me quickly introduce myself. So my name is Reineke. I work for Nespresso, the Netherlands. I'm the sustainability lead there. As Nespresso is a global corporate company, we work with serving a premium coffee brand, which was founded in 1986 with sort of ensuring that everyone has the possibility to drink easily coffee as a barista, but then at home from a capsule system. What we from the beginning really wanted is to have sustainability throughout our full supply chain. So as of the beginning, we started to look at all kinds of initiatives that worked with a sustainability business approach, I would say. And that's why we founded our AAA program, which supports farmers in training on sustainable farming practices, for example, but also improves their livelihoods. So as most of, basically all our farmers are not based in Europe, but in other parts of the world, certain things like having a pension are not so evident as it is in Europe. So we're not only looking at the regenerative agriculture kind of thing. So what is needed to ensure that coffee is what we like to say a force for good. I think everyone has seen in the news that the coffee prices went through the roof, and that is because of climate change. I mean, there's no other way of saying it. Besides the fact everyone loves coffee and wants to drink more, but besides that, climate change is actually causing that a price because the crops are really sensitive and they are affected by the climate change. So what was I saying? So except from agriculture impact, we're also looking at what we can do for community perspective. So not only sustainability, but also social economy impact. So you already highlighted that Nespresso has a sort of different supply chain. And that's basically because we know all our farmers and we know what happens with the product throughout the full supply chain until it's actually at the consumer level. We have our own retail stores and we sell it ourselves online. And therefore we basically have all the data because everything is handled by ourselves, which makes it easier to, first of all, collect the data and use the data to improve on all kind of aspects. So if I need to highlight some aspects which are really pointing out, I would say is one of the things that we are focusing on farmer level is, for example, the agroforestry. I'm not sure I'm saying that right, but is that we're not only looking at what the crop needs itself, so what does a coffee plant need, but also the impact of integrating, for example, trees next to the coffee plant to ensure that it has shades, but also it's enhancing biodiversity, but it's also protecting the coffee plants for extreme weathers like heat or water, because it's not all the same crop at the same land. And we have examples of that, for example, in Costa Rica. So in our coffee plantage in Costa Rica, we're really focusing on that kind of activities. And on the other hand, we are really focusing on how we can look at the water usage. So reducing the amount of water and therefore, ensuring that we have irrigation techniques there, for example, that we're doing in Ethiopia. So that kind of activities are really key to ensure that we can continue drinking coffee also in the future and the next generation.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Reineke. There were a few questions because obviously the first part of this conversation really focused on the European context. And we had questions from Eduardo and Flavio in the chat asking about, how does this look in different contexts? So I know you touched on it a little bit, but could you give us a little bit more on, what are the different challenges compared to what has been said so far that these supply chains might face overall, but then also specifically from Flavio, there's a question on, smallholder farmers in tropical countries. How can we diminish the risk in the transition process with those types of farmers?
Yeah, so to start with the last part, I would say, so as I shortly mentioned, Nespresso has the AAA program, which we are doing together with Rainforest Alliance, on which we're really focusing, and our aim is to have 95% of all our coffee farmers by 2030 having regenerative agriculture practices in place. That was a horrible sentence to say, sorry. So what are we focusing on? So it's really be resilient with all the climate change. So how are we ensuring that those kind of challenges are actually known at farmer level? That means that we have to have people in the field and engage with farmer to build trust, to train them properly, to ensure that the benefit for the farm is not only on the short term, which is most of the time money, but also on the longer term. So explain that you're not doing this just only so you get more money today, so you will be able to buy the food for tonight, but that we're also like to build that community, so that the next generation can also be still farmer, and be able to make coffee for the next generation, and that the kids of that farmer can continue doing that as well. So it's really looking at, I think Simon already mentioned that, it's looking at the longer term, because everyone wants a little bit more money today, but it sometimes means that you need to take a little step back, but it will come back in the end, because we can't change the climate in the way it's actually happening nowadays. So we need to be, first of all, resilient to ensure that we can face that. Yeah.
Thank you, Reineke. There's also a question from Martin, that to hear a little bit more about your sort of direct connection that you have with farmers. You mentioning that you know all of your farmers. They asked, can you give us an idea of how many farmers are supplying to you, because they thought that was quite an impressive point.
Yeah, it's over 400, but there are some of them are really big and have a huge coffee farms, and some of our smaller. And don't forget, you can coffee from Brazil, but you also have from Ethiopia, Indonesia, Guatemala, Costa Rica. So there are Vietnam. So there are even, we're also focusing on the areas that used to be areas where coffee grown, but not anymore, to see what is needed to be able to do that in the future. But it's a certain band around the world, I would say, where the coffee grows, where the climate is optimum.
Perfect. Okay, I'm trying to get through as many of these questions. Yes, go ahead, Simon, please.
Yeah, I would just add a point, especially for all the supply chains where that are not vertically integrated or has a direct. I think actually, I absolutely would echo that there is a huge problem with the long tail, all the smallholder farmers, because that, to my understanding at least, the challenges are actually just mounting, because yes, they have to take a step back, but the economic constraints are even harder, and they're not necessarily bankable just to take a 5-year loan to buy new machinery and overcome a drop in economic profitability. So I actually think we need to stack up more services and values to actually offer smallholder farmers enough to overcome the short-term pains on the one side. Two is, smallholder farmers do not necessarily have access to free agronomic consultants that can explain them exactly how to do in the field, so the how. And I think that, and then finally, there's the verification. One of the big challenges is that if you have to have a person out in the field and inspecting and measuring, and so the cost of verification on a per farmer basis is just very high, and therefore it's simply not profitable in many systems to do it. For smaller farmers is the reality. And therefore, but this is also where I think technology and technology development can really remove the hurdle. So as we're bringing down the cost to serve on technology, that is where we both can create verification outcomes also for smallholder farming, but actually using technology. I mean, I can use ChatGPT now to get answers for most of what I otherwise would ask advisors for 5 years ago, and it's a silly example, but I actually think coupled with the right data that can fuse in the right context, I actually think technology offers a huge opportunity to really take this to millions of farmers instead of handfuls or hundreds that we're looking at.
If I can just build on what you say, Simon, what you say is very important actually. And we in Mars, when we finance a program on regenerative agriculture, we basically have 3 buckets of cost. So we pay the technical support, we pay farmer premium, and then we have the cost of measuring. And we really need to pay attention that this cost is not, do not become the main cost of the program. We really want our value to go to the farmer and them increasing capabilities and not just us measuring for our reporting. So the developing technology that can help reduce that cost and be efficient is very key for us.
And if I can build on that, Claire, and also a bit on what Simon just mentioned, I think what is really important to mention is that it's not one shoe that fits all. So it's really the local need is totally different, not only in every other country, but even on, because I'm only talking about coffee plants, so I talk about one crop, but even within a country, it's really important to look, how does the soil look like? What are the techniques which are there already? What is the biodiversity there at that moment in time? What do we need to do at that point with the data that we have to ensure that we increase that biodiversity? So it's really important to look at the local, really specific need and not your JetGPT like Simon just mentioned, because that will not give you the answer for the longer term, maybe the short answer.
Perfect. I wanted to, you mentioned the finance part is so interesting, and there was also a question on like what steps should the financial industry take to actively contribute here? Because obviously we have 4 different types of organizations involved that all seem up for it and wanting to be a part of this. Who is it that we're not getting involved? Is it the finance industry, or just overall, who are the tougher actors? How can we get them better involved? Is there a tough actor that we've gotten involved before, and how did we actually make that happen? Would be great to get some thoughts on that. Simon.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit biased. I spent 15 years as a banker before this. So I think it's hugely important to get the financial industry mobilized. But for the financial industry to be mobilized, it requires maturity and scalability. It's foundational. And I think we're approaching that point. And we on our end have made the first partnerships with large pan-European banks, and the banks are looking to do different things here. One is to actually understand in the first place, take their part of helping both decarbonize and understand the footprint and the practice of the farmers in their book. So that's a data play, and I think more and more banks, both from a compliance and from a voluntary perspective, will start pushing for that. But 2 is what banks can do is to provide green lending. So once we have the data and data is solid, then we can actually start help banks create green loans and discounted financing to farmers. I think that becomes what I expect to see is that becomes what's called blended finance, where you see governmental guarantees and different other organizational guarantees. So we actually create discounted and attractive financing for farmers to overcome that hurdle, because that's what we have to come back to all the time. It is a hurdle that has to be overcome, and that needs to be bankable, that hurdle. We're not fully there yet. But I think that will come within the next few years. And I think that's a very important part of also scaling to the long tail, to the smallhold farmers in doing this. So we can basically, and now it's getting a little bit finance geeky, we can basically create financial covenants related to how farmers are practicing in order to create them cheaper financial products.
Thank you, Simon. And thank you for outing yourself as a previous financial actor. Claire, was there anything from your side on like different actors to get involved, and how do we get them better involved in these sort of discussions?
So I don't have any insights. I mean, a lot of insight today, because we don't include financial actors in our program yet, but I definitely see a role of bank and insurance basically in supporting the transition to the farmers. And I think it's also really a lot to what Thomas said, that, you know, on small farmers, they cannot always afford machinery, etc. So how the financial institution can support them. And just to give you an example that of a program we have in the US, that they haven't worked with a bank, but basically our brand Nutro in the US has designed a grant to provide to farmer to actually have the money to buy a new machinery, etc. But that was Mars, not a bank. But I think that's where also bank can play a role here.
Thank you. Okay, going a little bit more specific, because of course.
Like, just back to that question of who needs to be involved. I think, like, you know, you covered the finance bit really powerfully. But when I speak to farmers, the finance bit is obviously essential. But also a big barrier is that kind of, I call it the confidence community, whatever you want to call it, that kind of belief that this is going to work type barrier. Because they haven't seen it work in their context or their situation before. I think that's really a big important one. And for that, we need other farmers to tell their stories, but we also need the agricultural industry to kind of believe, if that makes sense. And I'm really looking at the kind of ag input providers, fertilizer providers, chemical providers, those sort of people. They have a big influence over farmers, and we need to bring them along on the journey. They have a tricky position in this, but they can be part of the solution.
Yeah. Do you work with government representatives at all in the UK context? How does that interaction work?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about UK politics if you want, but we obviously had the disaster, I think I can say that, of leaving the EU. That's my position. That did mean that the government subsidies and grants in the UK were massively changed, and they are really pushed now to supporting the type of farming that I do, kind of, we have done, which is exciting. So I think government does have a really exciting opportunity in this and a part to play. I think the interesting bit is, do they come with the stick or do they come with a carrot? And should we be scared of the stick, so we should get on with it? That's the kind of interesting discussion I have with the government all the time, really.
I want to get to a few questions. There were a lot of them on soil health and basically saying the exact same thing. What does it mean in measurement? What does soil health mean? How do you measure it? What is it defined by? Would be great to know. I mean, Thomas, maybe starting with you, and then Simon, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, absolutely. So soil is not one thing. It's not one measurement that makes, oh my God, this is now healthy soil and this was bad soil. It's a complex system, right? But the real best way to understand it is the amount of biological life that's available or active in that soil. And the best kind of generic measurement that we have for that in all countries is organic matter measurements. And that's really just for measuring the amount of organic matter, organic material, organic life in the soil. That's a good kind of prerequisite to how kind of biologically active that soil is. But you can, we do it a lot. You can have sensors. There's a whole world of trying to understand the depths of soil. We don't. That's also an interesting thing. We don't understand everything about soil. But I think what we do understand is the more alive you can make it, the better. And we do farm tours here a lot, and especially corporates, I love to get them to go in one of our neighbors' fields and really smell it and see how it feels, and then come into one of our fields and smell it and see how it feels, and you will instinctively know the difference.
Perfect. You want to add anything, Simon? Thomas covers it perfectly.
I'm pretty sure I have nothing to add on the optimal way of soil sniffing.
Okay, we can leave that there. And then there were a lot of questions on carbon, and I know that we're starting to get to the bottom, to the end of the time, but maybe Simon, there were two on sort of, the issue of duplicative and double accounting. How do you ensure that there's no double accounting, and how are you measuring carbon these days? Were two questions that maybe you can bundle in one.
I don't know. I think they're quite different nature. The term of accounting, I think, is quite interesting, and it basically goes back to the same interoperability theme as we discussed before. I think it starts from a very positive of actually there is something to account. There's an economic value to account in the first place. So I think that's very positive. There's no, obviously it'll be optimal if we had a global ledger of one truth. I'm personally not holding my breath on that one. I think there it's, and if you parallel the financial economic system has been built exactly on the same principle. One is that the receiver of the goods, might be someone who buys a carbon credit, that might be someone who has the right that goes with the crop for footprint, need to ensure that they have at least that they have indeed bought a right or an asset. And the other is that the farmer has to have liability, has to subscribe and have liability in the case that they double sell to someone. It's not a physical asset, and therefore fraud is a risk. But it's a two-sided handshake that is done, and I think the industry have already seen where farmers have not been aware and just selling the same right, left, right, and center. I think we've also already seen examples of where either off-takers or the food industry have made claims without actually having even had the right from the farmer. I ultimately think about it as a right, just like a music right. The farmer produces an ecosystem service, and that is a right. We turn that into a digital right that can be handed over to someone else as a claim. And then we put the reasonable bells and whistles and guardrails around that.
Great. Okay, I think we'll have to. I think we've gotten through quite a few good questions from the audience. I do just want to hear from each of the panelists. You know, we're starting to see that we have a lot of the answers to some of these big challenges, a lot of those points that were raised in the word cloud. We're seeing that pilot projects are able to scale. We're seeing some ideas and of where that financing can come from, who are the actors you can get involved, who can you turn to if you're trying to do this from the start, i.e. it seems like Thomas is ready to give everyone his phone number, so maybe just to get some idea from him. There's also questions, Thomas, from the crowd on like if you have any case studies to share. So if you have any afterwards, send them to us and we can share that with all of the registrants as well. But you know, where do we go from here? What are the 1-2 takeaways that, you know, to try and really make this work for the next 15 years, so that we can look back at this and be and feel like we've gotten even further? It might need to be like half minutes from each. So maybe Reineke, I can start with you.
Yeah, of course. I think the most important thing is if you look at the beginning when Nespresso was founded in 1986, things were totally different compared to today. So we to ensure that we have that the future is ready for everything, so that we can continue drinking coffee also in the future, I would say we need to adapt on what's happening. And although we think that we know what kind of weather it is in March, I'm quite sure that 10 years ago, we didn't have that blue sky as Thomas has now in his background. And I think that says it all. We're really enjoying the great weather, which is actually happening now. But in other parts of the world, it's not so great while we expect it to be great. So to be adaptive, to be resilient, and to also prepare us for the future, for the next generation, I would say that is the most important thing. And I will stop.
Great. Thank you. So we have keep adapting. Claire, what's yours?
Yeah, I think what I can take away is that we still have a lot of challenge ahead of us, and indeed adapting is key. And the challenge that we have are mainly technical, because the more climate change is arriving, the more difficult it is to make the transition. We have example in central Hungary, where the farmer cannot grow cover crop anymore due to the the severe drought like we have for a couple of years already. We have methodological challenge, I would say, at also for a corporate like us, so ensure the robustness, and the accuracy and the transparency on the data use, on the methodology. It's kind of a new era, and it's evolving a lot. A lot also, as well as the policies are evolving and everything. So we need to be to be straight on that one. And I would say the last challenge is financial. So as Simon and Thomas said, it makes sense only at the farm level on the regenerative practices. We usually source maybe 1 or 2 crops of a given rotation in a region. So how to ensure that there is off-taker for the other crops. But basically, I'm sure that we have all the solution at hand. We have all the partners that we need. We just need to create this link and to go ahead.
Perfect. So technical knowledge sharing, ensuring robustness, and the financing. Thomas, what from your side?
Yeah, good question. I think, first of all, I think this is like, from my perspective, it's like the most exciting time to be a farmer ever, because like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, say, nobody really cared. I wouldn't be invited to webinars like this. But nowadays, everybody's really interested and everybody wants to get involved and everybody wants to learn. So I think that's like really exciting, optimistic. And then I would say, like, welcome farmer innovation. Farmers are super innovative, and there's so many more practices that I would love to try and adopt on our farm. And working with supply chain players always makes that easier. So that kind of collaboration through the supply chain is super important. But that also comes from me and farmers. We need to be more open to talking to, have websites and talk more about what we do. So I think open communication is kind of my hope more.
Perfect. Open communication. Simon, round us off.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I would just like to put a perspective to this. When I personally started this journey 6 years ago, I went around talking to politicians and farmers and companies about regenerative agriculture, and people literally thought it was a cult. I think it's mind-blowing how far we come in 5-6 years. We're having a webinar with this. I was at the EU and New York Times. Everyone is talking. Most people still don't know exactly what it is, but everyone is talking about it. And I think that whether it's on an implementation level, a policy level, a methodology level, a data level, a technology level, I think at all a scientific level, not to forget, I think just the last 5 years has made humongous progress. Now I think it's all about scaling. So for me, I think that personally, at least my patience for people just talking with no action is becoming more and more limited because time is not on our side, and therefore I think there's a right to talk here, which also is all about scale. There are 4 billion hectares of cropland globally, give or take, and I still think we have a long way to go. So this is one big scaling challenge over the next 5 to 10 years. And it's not getting easier, as Claire rightly pointed out.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, this is one of many conversations that we can look forward to continue to host on this topic. As you can see, there's so many questions coming through. There's so much more we could cover, but just a big thank you to all speakers, for all attendees, for all of your questions. Well, definitely get in touch with anyone from the team, different ways of doing that, or, with Thomas and Simon and Agreena, anyone from the team to continue those sort of conversations. This doesn't just end here. So really, we want this to keep going and keep breathing. So yeah, thank you to all. Do everyone keep in touch if you wanted, if you have any more ideas on webinars and topics we should be continuing to have conversations on, there'll be a little pop-up that comes up when you close this window. We'll be sending the recording and everything, but just a huge thank you to all speakers and specifically Agreena for making this webinar possible. Thank you to all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.